to the stream. But before that, I am going to just make sure that everything's okay because I just want to make sure that we are in the stream and I'm okay here. Okay, awesome. So I'm gonna get started now. Hopefully I can switch slides. Okay, awesome. So before we jump into all the content that I had just mentioned and things that we're planning to do today, sorry, that was a little bit of feedback. I hope that everyone looks into following Fiveable on any type of different social media account. We have accounts on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, and I believe we also have a TikTok now that isn't mentioned here, but feel free to join that and look at that as well. So I'm going to move on to the next slide and jump in a little bit more about the ACT Science section. So the ACT Science section is the science section, of course, but it is split into different types of topics. So like different sections of the ACT and SAT, where you might be tested on, for example, ACT math, you're going to be tested on algebra and geometry and trig and stats. You're going to be tested on a lot of different topics. And that's pretty much the same for science as well. Whereas math is a little bit more focused on different subjects. Like I mentioned, you'll be tested on algebra and geometry. Science isn't like that. You're not going to be tested on one bio, one chem, one physics, even though that is a very common pattern. It isn't formatted like that, which means that you're not going to get a bio score, a chem score, a physics score, an earth science score. You're going to get scores that are actually by different topics and different concepts. So I'm going to jump into that first. And this is probably where we're going to spend the first 25% of the stream is just talking about this, because this is something that a lot of people don't know. And this isn't something I even knew until I took my first ACT. So questions come in 3 different formats. If you've taken a standardized test, you might have noticed that sometimes you'll get questions that are really content-based, and sometimes you'll get questions that are graphs, and it really just varies. And that's the same with the ACT Science. You're going to get some questions that are more focused on data, some that are more focused on research summaries, and some that have to do with conflicting viewpoints. So I'm going to dive into those a little bit first. So first, we're going to start actually with the middle column, because it is the most common type of question that you'll see on the ACT Science. And if you've taken a practice test, if you've seen an ACT Science section, if you've taken it before, you probably have seen that the majority of the questions are asking about research. So luckily, you don't need to go into this test knowing any type of research study whatsoever. You are handed those studies and you are asked to read them. And basically, these are just asking about your comprehension of the research experiment. So again, you don't need to know any actual content. You won't need to know about some random experiment that was done in the 1870s, but you'll need to have a pretty good understanding of how to understand given research experiments. So just some things that they might ask you about. They might ask you about the experimental design. What might be the independent variable? What might be this type of variable? Did they use any type of special grouping in the experiment if they have that? And they might ask you to interpret the results. What does this mean if at the end of the experiment they found this? And again, a lot of that is very content-based, so you don't really have to worry about coming with previous knowledge of experiments. This is a lot about your ability to read and comprehend information that's given to you. And then we're going to go to the left, the data representation, which is the second most common question format that you'll see on the ACT Science. And the ACT Science is really unique in that it has a lot of writing and it'll have paragraphs, but it also will have more tabular forms of information. So not only will you get information in paragraph form, you'll also get tables and graphs and charts, and we'll see that a little bit more as we get into actual problems later on. But this type of question is just asking you to interpret or understand or find information that's given to you in those formats. So they might ask you to maybe find a relationship between data. If the X goes up, is the Y going to go up or is it going to go down? Interpolation and extrapolation. Can we find this value for a number that's maybe outside of the range of the table? And then try to translate data in tables into graphs. Can I turn all the numbers in this XY chart and turn it into a bar graph or turn it into a linear graph? And that's pretty much what it's asking you to do. Just, again, interpreting and understanding data. And then this is the least common question that you'll find on the ACT Science. And it also tends to be the more complicated type of question for a lot of people that take this exam, because some different questions will have two different conflicting viewpoints, or sometimes even more. I remember seeing practice ACT exams that have up to 4 different conflicting viewpoints. And the question will ask you to look at these 2 explanations and compare them or contrast them, or find where one might be a little faulty or misleading, or understand these 2 people's perspectives and how they got them. So oftentimes this is very complicated for people because you have different perspectives, that may be complicated or may just not sound right or may differ from one another. So this is also why there's a lot less of these questions. There'll typically be like one article that'll have the majority of these conflicting viewpoint questions. But again, it isn't the majority of the test, but because it is 15 to 20%, if this is your weakest link on the exam, we will be going over this today. I believe there is one question that might have contrasting viewpoints and understanding those. So these are the 3 types of questions, just to reiterate, for those who came in a little later. These are the 3 types of questions that you'll see. All the questions will probably, actually definitely, go into either of these 3 different formats. So you cannot really be surprised with what types of questions are there. They give you, and this is all from the ACT website, these are the 3 different types of questions that you're going to find. So also know that we do have a Q&A and a question section and a chat that I'm looking at on the side. So if you do have any questions as we go by, I can answer those. And there might be a TA answering in the Q&A. I'm not entirely sure if we do have that. I do have one working today. But you can just throw in questions and I can answer them along or save them to the end. So moving on, we're going to go into the reporting categories. And basically the ACT, again, will give you different scores based on how well you do in each little subsection of science. So like how math will, if you take the ACT, will give you a score on your trig, will give you a score for functions, will give you a score for algebra. ACT Science, again, like I mentioned before, isn't going to give you a score for bio, chem, physics, earth science. It's going to give you a score for 3 different major categories of question. So before we were talking about question format, and not today, but the next slide, we're talking about actual question content. So you'll be getting scores on these 3 major topics that you're going to be tested on. So first is going to be, we're going to start from biggest to smallest. So the biggest amount, the one with the most amount of questions that you're going to get graded on is interpretation of data. And I feel like that makes sense. Like the test is trying to test your ability to understand data that's given to you and maybe apply it to different situations. So that's actually exactly what I wrote for the description. You're understanding data that's presented in different formats, whether it be given to you in a table or a graph or a chart or in a paragraph. It just wants to see that you're able to, see trends, maybe translate information from 2 different sources, from like table to graph to paragraph to graph, and reason things mathematically. Maybe if you find a pattern or a trend in your data, might want to understand why that is. Why is your Y getting bigger? Oh, because my X is also getting bigger, or something like that. So that's the majority of this exam. And I feel like that's kind of straightforward just because I feel like a science exam is obviously going to test your ability to understand scientific data. So now moving on, we're going to jump to evaluation of models, inferences, and experimental results, just because that's the second most tested topic. So we're going to just go in order of importance, maybe. Sorry, there's a police car if you guys hear that. So this is worth 25 to 35% of your entire exam is going to has something to do with models or experiments or inferencing. And just how it sounds, again, it's very direct. You need to interpret information that's given to you. I have this table, I have this paragraph, just trying to understand what it's saying and then using that information that you find in different types of situations. So, what I mean by that is if I find this trend in my table, I have to formulate an explanation for why I see that trend in the table. Again, I'm using the same example. If my graph is increasing and y is increasing, why is it? Is it because x is increasing? Is it because x is decreasing and it's a negative graph? It's basically forming explanations for trends or maybe even different things that they'll notice in the article, things that the fake people that they mention in the article may realize in their data, and maybe predicting future patterns. If a graph continues to increase, is it going to continue increasing? If a graph is doubling its y values, is it going to continue increasing or is it going to reach a zero? That's what this is going to ask you. And then our least common, but still pretty significant chunk of the test, it is still 20 to 30%, is going to be the scientific investigation. And this is when your knowledge of experiments is going to come into play. There are experiments on the ACT Science, not real experiments, experiments with fake people and fake different methods. And this part of the test is just going to test your ability to understand the different parts of the experiment. And this really comes down to you understanding really science that you had learned earlier in middle school. What's the independent variable? What's the dependent variable? What is the control group? What is similar between these two experiments? What might happen if we do this with more of a chemical? So again, this section I think is the most like middle school science that you had taken. Of course, a little bit more difficult, obviously, because this is a high school level exam and not from 6th to 8th grade. But it's testing your knowledge of a lot of really basic, like foundation science topics that you'll know. Independent variables, dependent variables, control groups, placebos, things like that. And if you've taken a class like, I'm trying to think, like a middle school science everyone has taken, but if you've taken a class like psychology, I feel like you're already at an advantage because you review pretty much these same topics. I feel that ACT Science has a lot of similarities and just expectations from students as you'll have in AP Psych if you've ever taken it. And the exams are obviously not very similar, but the one of the FRQs is very similar to this, and where you need to identify variables and guess what might happen based on trends. So if you have taken a psychology class, you might be really good at scientific investigation. If not, that's okay. We're going to be going into that a little bit further as we go on. And I'm just checking the comments. I don't see anything that could just be an issue on my part, but I don't see any comments or questions. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is going to have to do about misconceptions. And I know you might be wondering, oh, I want to get into questions, or I want to get into, the actual like meat and like potatoes of ACT Science. But I think this is a slide where we're probably going to spend a good 20 minutes just talking about misconceptions about the ACT Science, because I find that this is so important going into the exam, because people have like this preconceived notion of what to expect on the ACT Science, and then are either really surprised when they see it or like really like, oh, so I think this is a slide where we really need to spend a lot of our time on today, because there's just a lot of misconceptions about the ACT Science that we need to go over, especially if this is your first time taking the ACT Science exam. So the first misconception is that you need to study science content to do well. And you might look at that and be like, Charlie, that makes absolutely no sense. Like when I take the ACT math, I need to study, or at least review, functions and geometry and different theorems. I need to review all this math stuff. So why don't I need to study science content to do well in the ACT Science? So a lot of people I've found that take the ACT science think that to do well in the ACT science, you have to like take out your bio textbook and your chem notes and your physics notes and just review a lot of that content. And while maybe knowing some really basic ideas of science, maybe like knowing pH or knowing how the general stuff about pH or maybe species might be important, you might be at a disadvantage if you do study science content. And this is why. The science exam is not testing your ability to understand really complicated science topics. So, like, if you think you need to know stoichiometry for the ACT science, you really don't. What you need to be good at is understanding the content that's given to you. The ACT science is really not expecting you to come in with all this crazy science knowledge from high school and apply it to the exam. Because in reality, these questions are not asking you to apply your own science knowledge for the most part. There are some exceptions. They're asking you to apply the science information that's given to you in the articles or the graphs that you're given. So your mind might be telling you one thing about how you know that science or how chemistry works, but in reality, you have to listen to like what it says in the article. The science content that's given to you in the article is 100 times more important than the science content that you might remember from your AP chemistry class. Now, the one exception that I will say to this is that if the science content that you do need to know, of which there is very little, but the science content that I would say is really important to know for the ACT science is middle school level general science. So if you are going into the ACT, maybe not remembering how, genes work, like dominant or recessive traits are, or at least know what they are. If you don't remember how the pH scale works, again, not the complicated parts of pH, you don't need to know how to calculate it. But if you don't know where an acid is and where a base might be, if an acid is a smaller number or a larger number, then you can review that type of content. The only type of content I would personally say that's really important, if you don't know it already, to refresh is maybe something like the scientific method, dominant recessive, which is which, pH, which side is acid, which side is base, where's my neutral, maybe knowing like the water cycle. Again, it's very introductory science that you need to know. So this misconception is kind of like half and half, where it's like you really don't need to study the complicated science content that you're thinking you need to study, but you definitely need to know that middle school science content decently well. Because while the exam is asking you to apply in most scenarios, sometimes there are questions where they ask you about like, oh, based on this and the pH in this experiment, would it be classified as an acid, a base, an alkaline, or none? And in that case, you'll maybe need to know some middle school science content and know that, your acid is the smaller number and your base is the larger number. But other than that, you really don't need to know any complicated science information. And I think that you'd be at a disadvantage if you really do study anything really complicated, because you really don't need it and you may start to overthink. So that's, I think, the biggest misconception on the ACT science exam, that you need to know crazy content. You really don't. So moving on, and I think this is a really good transition, the ACT tests your comprehension of scientific topics. And this is a really popular misconception because I think, again, as I had mentioned before, people think science, and they're like, oh, they're going to test my ability to understand science like how the math exam tests your ability to, do math. And that just isn't true. The ACT science, while it does ask, like I mentioned before with the pH example, it does ask very not that often you to understand different scientific topics. The ACT science overall is a lot more like a reading section than a true science section. The ACT science is not testing your comprehension of science topics. It's testing your comprehension of reading about science topics. So what I mean is, if the ACT was truly testing your comprehension of scientific topics, it would ask you to, solve and do some stoichiometry, or maybe explain Newton's third law or whatever. something along those lines. But in reality, it's having you read articles and it's having you examine graphs and tables. And that just shows that the exam is a lot more about your comprehension of just writing, different reading, even your comprehension of very introductory foundational math concepts with stuff like charts or graphs. So again, I had kind of mentioned this one earlier, so I don't want to keep talking about the same thing. But don't think that the ACT Science is testing your ability to understand really complicated scientific topics, because overall, it is called the science section, but it is testing your ability to understand writing most of all. It is I want you to take out of this is that the ACT Science is testing your ability to understand reading and writing about science, not sciences itself. So moving on, our third misconception, just going to check the chat really quick, and I don't see anything, but that could just be an issue on my part, is the ACT Science section is complicated. And I think a lot of people do think that it is very complicated. And of course, we all have different strengths and weaknesses. So some people might think it is very complicated, and some people may not think it is, with different topics in general. There's people that are stronger in math and stronger in English. So don't take this as for everyone, it's going to be complicated, and for everyone, it's going to be easy, because it really depends from person to person and strength to strength. But what I really want to focus on with this misconception is that the ACT Science section, I think people overthink a lot with it and make it seem more complicated than it is. And that just has to do with the fact that it is a written section. People think that, going in, that I need to know equations and formulas. And in reality, it's asking you to just read articles and look at graphs. And I think that takes people aback a second. They look at, something they maybe are not used to on a science exam. I know from when I took science exams in early high school, they were very problem-based. They weren't descriptions of experiments, stuff like that. I don't think I've ever had to really do a really formal lab report. So when you come into this exam and you see that you're reading, I think people start to think that it is more complicated than it is, because it's not like other science exams they have seen in the past. Another thing that I think people also think the ACT Science exam is more complicated than it is because, again, you think you have to know all that science knowledge. And a lot of people don't know that pretty much every answer to those science questions, with the exception of a few, are in the actual writing or the graph or the article. You don't have to go in knowing some crazy theorems. You don't need to know anything really complicated about science for the most part. You just need to be able to read an article and take out the most important information from that and the most important information from the graphs. And I am making that seem a little easier than it is, but I just want to talk about that because I think people do have that misconception that, I need to know all this content, and then they go in and they don't know that the answers are almost all of them in the actual writing and questions itself. And a lot of the times, especially with answers that are writing, the answers are word for word from the article. And you might have realized that if you've done ACT reading, sometimes the questions will be, word for word from the actual article. But for science too, a lot of the actual answers are word for word from the article. So that's just something to take from that. This is a really, really important thing to mention, especially because I know we're with a group of very academically oriented people who may think they might be at an advantage if they take the ACT over the SAT, or maybe people that are trying out both exams and trying to see which they did better on. I know I'm one of those. I took both the ACT and SAT, did miles better on the ACT than the SAT. So this is something that I want to bring up for people that want to take both exams or may have chosen to focus on the ACT, not because they did better on it, but because they think they'll be at an advantage in the college admissions process. So this misconception is that prospective science majors will be at an advantage if they take the ACT over the SAT. You cannot imagine how many times I've heard people say that they want to take the ACT because they have a science section and that's going to look better for them. If you think that you'll do better with a science section, and I know I did, that science section is something that really helped me in my overall score that I wouldn't have gotten from the SAT, do it. 100%. That's just one of the great things about the ACT, especially for people that are really good at reading and, explaining and interpreting. But don't think that you're going to be at an advantage if you're applying as a STEM major and taking the ACT, because both exams are really seen in the same light in the college admissions process. No one's at an advantage for taking the ACT over the SAT or the SAT over the ACT. I've heard that rumor from teachers a lot, which is really interesting. But no one's at an advantage. If you live in an SAT majority area like I do, they're not going to look at you weird for taking the ACT. And if you take the ACT, they're not going to look at you weird for applying to a school in an SAT majority area. That's just not true. Also, I hear a lot of people think that, if I'm going to be a science major, whether that be bio or chemistry or physics or whatever, taking the ACT science will really show that I have a good knowledge of scientific topics. And it's true. The ACT science is going to show someone that you have a good foundational knowledge and you're really strong in scientific reasoning and inferencing. Obviously, like I mentioned before, it's not going to show that you're able to do quantum mechanics, but it really shows that you're good with the foundational stuff of science. But I think people take this as the ACT is going over science and the SAT doesn't cover science at all, which is such a misconception. So while the SAT doesn't have a science section, the SAT will have reading articles that will have questions that include graphs and include data. And they'll have articles that are also science-based. They'll have one that's about some type of earth science, or maybe they'll have one about biology. I remember seeing practice ones that SATs that had questions after an article about astronomy. So don't think that the ACT, if I'm a science major, I should take the ACT because it has science tested. Because if you've ever taken the SAT, you know that even though they don't have a science section, they are indirectly testing your knowledge of science through those types of questions and through those types of articles. In fact, the ACT, for those who are also considering the ACT, does have a breakdown like the ACT does, where 20% of this is on this type of topic. And then they'll say, you got a 19 out of 20 on this topic. Good job. The ACT has that whole science exam score, but the SAT also has I'm not sure about the exact wording, but there is a knowledge of science and knowledge of history / social science section. So when you get your SAT score, you still are getting, even though it isn't a whole section grade, you are getting a score in science and history / social science. So don't think that, I'm a science major, I'm going to take the ACT because it tests science, because the SAT also tests science. It's just not a section that they do have graded. And don't think if you're taking the SAT that you can, or taking the ACT, you can get out of having to deal with a written type of science. Both of them test science, albeit in different ways. And obviously the ACT, it's a lot more heavily weighted than on the SAT because they don't have a science section. But both of these exams are going to test your ability to understand science. So you really can't get out of science with either of these exams. If you are a little bit more confident on actually reading with science, then you might want to take the ACT, because obviously it's 4 scores put into one, whereas the SAT is 2. You have your reading and writing grammar section, your math, and your ACT, you have your 4 put into one. But don't think you're going to get out of science. And that kind of also goes into the last one. The ACT is the only standardized test that tests science. Well, obviously, AP exams do test science. But when I'm talking about standardized tests, I'm talking about standardized tests for college admissions. The SAT also tests science, obviously not in as direct of a way, but you'll still have articles about science, and you'll have articles with a graph. So you'll have to test your knowledge of science in one way or another. It's just 2 different ways of doing it. And I liked the ACT science and I liked how the ACT was more in general, so that's why I ended up focusing on the ACT. But yeah, some really, really important misconceptions to just clear before testing day. I'm not sure if everyone here is testing on, I believe next Saturday is another testing. I'm not sure if everyone's testing for those, but those are some really important misconceptions just to clear before you get into the test room. So I believe, yes, we're moving into our first question. So one thing to mention before we get into this, these passages for the ACT Science will typically have like one passage and then like 5 questions after it. But we're going to do one passage, one question, one passage, one question. And a lot of these passages are really long, just because we're only doing one question with them, obviously not 5. So, of course, these articles vary in length, but the ones that I had chosen because I wanted to get, some tables in, some writing in, some graphs in, some different perspectives in, I chose some of the longer ones. So what I'm going to end up doing is just having you guys read independently. I'm going to give you like 3 minutes to read these independently because there's a lot of stuff here. And because you're not actually testing, why not use the time? So I'm going to give you guys, I think, 3 minutes to read these questions. And then I'm going to read the actual passage out loud with while you guys are trying to figure out the answer. And then we're going to go over it together. And we're going to do, I think, 3 questions total. I think it should work with how long some of these passages are. So I am going to mute myself and start a timer for 3 minutes. So hopefully this is big enough. I believe it is big enough. If not, you can screen share. Not screen share. You can use like the expand button in the lower right-hand corner, and you can make the image bigger, and you'll probably be able to read it. I see a message in the chat. Let us know when to submit our answers. You can submit for question 1 whenever you'd like. I'll tell you guys when the 3-minute timer is up, but you can send your answer, like your letter, in the chat whenever. Whenever you have it and whenever you're confident in your answer, you can send it. I am going to just quickly set a timer for 3 minutes, and you guys can go attack that question. And then if you have any questions, we're going to clear them up afterwards. Good luck. This is just a 45-second warning before we start reading the actual question for anyone that's still working on it. Okay, everyone, so I'm going to start reading the actual question. Just for anyone that might have had difficulty with the question, I'm just going to read it. Maybe hearing it will help you find a better answer, or maybe find the answer if you're having difficulty before. So I'm going to read it. This is passage 2. So there was one before, but I had chose not to go over it, but I'm going to start reading it now. When certain substances are added to Diet Cola, CO2 gas is produced, generating a foam. 2 experiments were done to study this process. In each trial, an apparatus, like that shown in figure 1's below, was used as follows. A jar was nearly filled with H2O and fitted with a 2-holed lid. One end of the tube B, was inserted through one of the holes and submerged. The other end of tube B was placed in an empty graduated cylinder. Another tube A, was inserted through the other hole in the lid. A certain solid substance was inserted into the other end of tube A, and the substance was secured by a clamp. Tube A was then attached to a freshly opened bottle containing 355 mLs of Diet Cola. The clamp was removed, releasing a substance into the Diet Cola. The foam that was produced traveled into the jar, and the liquid was transferred into the cylinder. The mass of CO2 was calculated based on the volume of liquid that was measured in the cylinder after foaming had ceased. So that's the main passage, and I'm going to move into the actual experiment section. So experiment 1. In each of trials 1 through 4, a different one of the 4 substances of equal mass, a piece of chalk, a sugar cube, and a fruit-flavored piece of candy, or a mint-flavored piece of candy, was added to the bottle of Diet Cola at 3 degrees Celsius. See Table 1. And they have Table 1. And then experiment 2. In each of trials 5 through 8, trial 4 from experiment 1 was repeated, except that the temperature of the Diet Cola was different in each trial. See Table 2. And they have Table 2. And the question is, suppose trial 6 had been repeated, but the bottle of Diet Cola has been opened and then left undisturbed at 25 degrees Celsius for 12 hours before it was attached to the apparatus. Would the mass of CO2 produced in this trial likely be greater than 0.969 or less than 0.0969? So, before we even get into that question is asking for a very specific section. It is asking for you just for trial 6, which is experiment 2. So while you would have needed to read this all for all the other questions, because this is just asking for trial 6, you really only need to look at experiment 2. I'm going to turn a light on because I feel like it's getting a little dark. I didn't realize that the sun was setting so late, but now that I guess summer's over, it's starting to get a little darker here. So moving on, actually. You really don't need the first section in experiment 1 for this type of question, but it is good to read to understand the experiment, because I'm sure if I had posted all the questions for this passage, there would have been something about experimental design, because that is a lengthy chunk of experimental design. So it seems like everyone got C. So I'm going to explain this very, very briefly, or at least how I would have gone about it. So I don't think we need to spend as much time on this just because of the number of people that got it correct. But when you leave out a fizzy soda, this is my logic behind it. You may have had a more like mathematical or exact, way of going about this, but this is how I thought of it. Like, this is my water bottle. Imagine this was left out with Diet Cola. And obviously, whatever is going in through the tube, that whatever substance is most likely reacting, since it's the CO2 gas that's being produced, it's definitely reacting with the actual carbonation in the soda. Again, you could have a whole other way of thinking about this. This is my way of thinking about this because I think about things when I don't have to. I don't think about things mathematically. So obviously, whatever is going in the substance is going in to cause a foam, it's reacting with something that's in the actual soda, right? So when you leave something open and undisturbed, especially a soda, it's going to go flat over time, right? So if you're going to leave something out flat, it's probably going to have, less CO2 produced just because there's less in the soda. And obviously, the concentration that's in there is going to decrease over time as you leave it out more. So that's just my way of thinking about it. If you guys had other ways, if you maybe had a more mathematical approach, maybe by using the chart and maybe seeing that, 678, like the mass of CO2 produced is going down, maybe as the temperature goes up. So you might have used that inverse relationship to explain that. I'm not sure, but that was just how I was thinking about it. If you guys have other ways, drop them in the chat, and I'll feel free to look at those. But it seems like we all got that question correct. So we're going to move on to the next question. And yeah, this question is also much shorter, so I'm only going to give you 2 minutes to read just because it's mainly graph focused. This is just a 1-minute warning. That's a 2-minute warning. So this question is asking, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's mainly graphs, so I don't really see the point in reading this. But this is asking us, so for the graph below shows for sound waves of 3 different frequencies, we have a 200 hertz, 500 hertz, and 1000 hertz, how alpha varies with relative humidity in air at a particular temperature. So based on figure 1, which is our first figure here, I don't know if you can see the arrow. The particular air temperature is most likely which of the following? Okay. So we have to first look at the relative, we have to actually first look at the alphas because those are what these two have in common. We're going to have a temperature and then we're going to have a relative humidity on our x-axis. But the only thing that these two have in common is our alpha, which is our y. So that's what we're going to look at first. And of course, this is asking for waves of 3 different frequencies, how alpha varies with temperature, at a 10% relative humidity. So by that, the answer should be B. Your answer should be 0 degrees Celsius. So I don't know what everyone else has seen because I can't see the chat and I got logged out, but your answer should be C percent. Your answer should be 0 degrees Celsius based on the fact that it's asking for how it is, how do I word this? How alpha is varying with relative humidity in air at a particular temperature. and the temperature and the percentages are there. And you also have to make sure that you're looking at the right axis. I feel like that's probably where people would get tripped up on this question, is just because they have different x-axes and the same y-axes. So that's just something to also really just take into account while you take this exam, is that there may be a question or a certain answer that looks really enticing at first just because, oh, they're the same number or whatever type of pattern that you might pick up on. But I think something that's really important to realize, or not realize, but notice or take into account, are labels and keys, especially for this type of question that has 3 different types of graphs, of which only 2 have the same x and y axes. So I think that's something really important. That's what I wanted to highlight, and it should be B. Yeah, okay. And then moving on to question 3, this is a little bit of a longer passage, so I'm going to give 3 minutes, and we're going to go over this very quickly, and then I'm going to open it up to Q&A, just more general questions about the ACT Science or ACT. So I'm going to start that 3-minute timer while you guys start reading that and going through the question. It's just a 1-minute warning before we go on to the question. Okay, awesome. So let's go and read. Wow, I thought I turned that off. Sorry about that. So let's start with the first, this question. So this has different studies, like I'd mentioned before. Some of them do have a lot of different studies, written in them, different varying perspectives or studies that might be completely different from one another. So that's something to take into account, that these are 3 different perspectives looking at one different topic, or maybe one very general topic with different, facets, or like with these two tables, or these four tables actually, but we're only looking at two based on the question. They're both looking at the same general topic. They're both looking at, sweeteners, but they're looking at them from different, topics or standpoints or perspectives, or what their goal is trying to look at, whatever they're trying to look at. So I am going to start reading this. This is passage 6. Of course, we skipped again, but I'm going to start reading this question. So 3 studies compared the effects of 5 sweeteners, and then those are sweeteners Q through U, which are pretty consistent for all of these, actually completely consistent, on food consumption by rats and on the concentrations of leptin and ghrelin. It's a little blurry, so I'm not sure if that's true, if that's what it says, hormones that regulate appetite in the blood of rats. Sweeteners Q through U differ only in the percent by mass of fructose and of glucose, and then see the table below. Now, I'm only going to read studies 1 and 2. I think those are probably the 2, and you guys probably don't want to read, through study 3 if we don't need to. So I'm just going to read studies 1 and 2, so don't be surprised when I just stop reading. So study 1, each of 5 groups 1 through 5 of rats, was assigned a solution of being 100 grams per liter concentration of one of the 5 sweeteners. Each rat was placed in a separate cage and provided unlimited access to the assigned sweetener solution and to solid food for 56 days. Table 6 shows for each group the amounts of sweetener solution and solid food consumed per rat per day. On day 56, blood was collected from each rat for analysis in studies 2 and 3, And then study 2, a 1 milliliter blood sample from each rat was placed in a separate test tube containing 0.2 milliliters of indicator N, which reacts with leptin to form a blue dye. The concentration of blue dye in each tube was directly proportional to the leptin concentration in the blood sample, and Table 3 shows the leptin concentration per sample for each group. That was very complicated. It was very wordy, but in reality, you don't need to know most of that information. You just need to focus on what the question is asking. And what the question is asking, let's just read the question. Consider the claim, the group of rats that consumed the lowest amount of solid food per day was also the group that had the lowest concentration of leptin per sample. Do the results of studies 1 and 2 support this claim? So because it's already telling us, do studies 1 and 2, we only need to look at questions 1 and 2. So we don't need to look at study 3 right now. We just need to focus on 1 and 2. 3 is really at this point just there to confuse you. You don't need to look at it. So do studies 1 and 2 support this claim? So we're just trying to make sure that which rats eat the least amount of food is the same as the rats that have the lowest concentration of leptin per sample. And this is just really your ability to read graphs and look at the numbers and compare. So I'm not sure if anyone wrote answers, but it seems like there's a few C's here. Okay, cool, awesome. So the answer is C here. If you do look at the graph, it's actually the opposite. So the rats in group 1 did consume the lowest amount of food, but the rats in group 5 had the lowest concentration of leptin. So it's actually not that the ones that had the lowest amount also had the lowest concentration. It's 2 separate groups with 2 separate data points. So I'm glad to see that we all went over that. I just saw the chat now, so I didn't see that there was some difficulty with question 2, but I'm really happy whoever answered that. I'm not sure if that was Peter, but whoever answered that, thank you for explaining that question, because that was a little bit of a more complicated graph analysis question. So I'm really happy that that was clarified. So now that we are 5 minutes out from this stream being over, I just want to check in and ask if anyone has any questions, not just ACT science related, even though that kind of is the point of today's stream. And, some questions about science would really be great. But if you guys have any questions about just the general ACT, I've taken the ACT and the SAT. If you want me to talk about how those two differ or why I chose what I did or anything related to either of those 2 exams, just feel free to ask any questions while we're still here. We do have 4 or 5 minutes, so ask away while we still have time. But yeah, I'm completely open to answering any type of content or any type of questions. So how would I suggest, I have this question from Gavin for anyone following, how would you suggest tackling the science questions? I think this is a really good question because they can be kind of wordy and lengthy, and they can waste a lot of time, is like the nicest way to put it, because of how wordy and lengthy and how complicated some of them, can look. It can be hard to tackle them because they're just so long. So, how I would tackle them is first, I think this is a very important skill for all standardized tests, especially the SAT and ACT, is just knowing how to skim well. So this is not a very in-depth reading of these passages, because during the exam, for any type of standardized test, whether it be the SAT or ACT, you're probably not going to have time to read an article in super depth and annotate. Some people are very pro annotating. I'm not really pro annotating. Whatever works for you works. But in my opinion, there just isn't enough time to do a proper reading and annotating. So first, I would tackle this by really just learning how to skim through things effectively. And if you were a big reader at one point, you probably do. That is a fire truck, and that's why there might be some noise in this next minute. So once you have a really good skim, I always recommend looking at the question and looking to see if they ask for a specific study, a specific data point, a specific person, anything specific that can limit what you really need to actually read in depth, because you're going to be reading this like skimming. So if the question is telling you that studies 1 and 2 are going to be important for one question, then really just skim through all of that, but really focus on 1 through 2. So that's how I would suggest reading these actual questions for the science section. If you don't know a question, because there are those times for everyone that's taken any type of SAT or ACT, there are times when you just don't know how to answer a question. I would just recommend moving on. I usually like to cross out through the questions I know the answer for. So when I do have time at the end of whatever period I do have left over to check my answers, I can just find the one question that isn't crossed out. So that is how I'd recommend tackling those questions. Hopefully that helped. I don't know if you have any specific worries, like maybe a specific content or a piece of maybe an experiment type of question, but for the general science question, that's how I'd recommend that you tackle it. If you are seeing a graph piece though, like a piece that is majority graphs with some little bits of writing, I really wouldn't recommend reading the writing all that in depth, because graph questions, the majority of the actual content that you need from the questions is probably just in those little data points on the graph. You just need to be able to recognize patterns in the graph, and it's really not asking you to know the one sentence explaining what the graph is before. Okay, so hopefully that helped. It is 4:59, so I think this is a good time to start doing a nice little conclusion, and wishing you guys all good luck. Just a reminder that Fiveable is doing ACT in preparation streams until the actual exam this Saturday. So yeah, so feel free to watch any type of videos that we do come out with. I believe we still have a math one, a review. So be sure to check out all those amazing streams with some of my fellow interns. I see a really quick question, so I'm going to go over that very quick before I end this stream. But Gavin asked, you have 10 questions left, 2.5 minutes left. What's the strategy? In my opinion, if there are any questions that have very long paragraphs, it's just not very achievable to do. Maybe you'll get through 5 questions, but if there's a large paragraph section, just move on to questions that are graph based, because those are very visual and will take a lot less time than actually reading and skimming. Even if you are using proper skimming techniques, it's really hard to do that in such a short amount of time. So if you have 10 questions and there's some graph related ones, or look at the chart or look at the table, I would say focus on those. But I think that's all we have for today. I hope that was somewhat helpful, and I wish you guys all good luck if you are taking the Saturday exam. Good luck on your ACT, and hopefully this was helpful and getting you guys and preparing you guys for ACT science. Thank you so much.